In the sleepy suburb of Ridgeview, where tree-lined streets lay beneath the afternoon sun, the narrator recalls his days as a newspaper deliveryman. He was an ambitious young man, looking to earn some extra money while exploring the quiet corners of his community. Each morning began with the sunrise dyeing the sky soft shades of pink and orange, reflecting off the windows of the well-kept homes that dotted the neighborhood. The morning routine was a familiar dance, the newspaper cart loaded with fresh editions, the aroma of coffee wafting through the air as residents began to wake up to a new day. Neighbors smiled in greeting, their calm and peaceful gestures reflecting the harmony that permeated the community. It was in this peaceful scenario that the narrator found himself immersed, unaware of the shadows that hid in the darkest corners of the neighborhood. As life followed its predictable course, a subtle foreboding of mystery began to creep in, like a gentle wind stirring the leaves of the trees before a storm. The furtive glances of the older residents, the occasional whispers of unexplained events in the silent nights, all of it created a simmering tension, a suggestion that beneath Ridgeview's serene facade, unknown secrets waited to be discovered. Each morning, the narrator roams the quiet streets of Ridgeview with his newspaper cart, his rhythmic footsteps echoing softly along the empty sidewalks. Among the many well-kept houses, there was one that stood out for its aura of solitude, Mrs. Dunham's residence. Situated at the end of a winding street, his wooden house seemed frozen in time, its windows always closed as if they held ancient secrets. Mrs. Dunham was an enigmatic presence in the community. An elderly woman of few words and fewer visitors, she received her daily newspaper with a punctuality that bordered on ritualistic. The narrator remembered how, in the first few days, she hesitated to approach that isolated house, as if she feared awakening something dormant. However, the need to complete his route overcame his apprehensions, and it soon became part of his morning routine. Little by little, he noticed small details that fueled his curiosity. The dim light that flickered in one of the windows at night, the occasional sound of muffled footsteps inside the house, all these clues that hinted at an unknown and perhaps tumultuous inner life. Neighbors' rumors of unusual sightings around the property only added to the mystery surrounding Mrs. Dunham. Thus, the solitary figure of Mrs. Dunham became an enigma to be deciphered for the narrator, a presence that aroused not only his curiosity, but also a slight shiver of uneasiness every time he approached that isolated house at the end of the street. With each visit to Mrs. Dunham's home, the narrator was greeted by a scene that defied normalcy. The lights in the house could occasionally be seen on during the early hours of the morning, casting shadows that danced on the drawn curtains. These fleeting moments were enough to fuel the growing intrigue of the newspaper deliveryman, who wondered about the lonely residents' nocturnal activities. On certain mornings, as the narrator approaches the front door, he notices quick, indistinct shadows moving behind the frosted glass of the entrance. They were fleeting glimpses, as if something or someone was always lurking, silently watching him. The feeling of being watched became more palpable as time passed, leaving him with a slight shiver down his spine that he tried to ignore as he went about his routine. The neighbors, when questioned, only murmured about the mysterious lady in the house at the end of the street, avoiding details that could clarify the strange occurrences. It was as if everyone shared a silent pact not to probe too deeply, each content to maintain a polite distance from the one who seemed to prefer her own isolation. Thus, the regular visits to Mrs. Dunham's house not only fulfilled the purpose of delivering the daily newspaper, but also became a journey of discovery for the narrator, who found himself increasingly involved in a mystery that seemed to deepen every morning that passed. As time passed, the narrator's curiosity regarding the secrets surrounding Mrs. Dunham's house grew almost obsessively. The murmurs of neighbors, whispered in quick conversations at the local grocery store or exchanged furtively at the foot of the gates, fed her imagination with stories of inexplicable events that occurred during the silent nights. It was said that strange lights were seen flickering in the windows of the house at inappropriate times, as if the house itself had a life of its own, a rhythm that did not match the standards of the other residents of sleepy Ridgeview. The most superstitious claimed to have seen shadows moving quickly through the closed curtains, while others swore they had heard indistinct murmurs that echoed through the deserted street. The rumors and stories intertwined, forming a web of intrigue around the enigmatic figure of Mrs. Dunham. Some urban legends spoke about events in the house's past, mentioning family tragedies and supernatural presences that haunted the silent hallways. For the narrator, these reports were not just meaningless gossip, but crucial clues that could unravel the mystery behind the isolated house's serene facade. Thus, influenced by the growing intrigue and stories circulating throughout the community, the narrator found himself increasingly determined to uncover the truth behind the inexplicable events surrounding Mrs. Dunham's life. Each newspaper delivery became not just an obligation, but a personal search for answers that seemed to be hidden in the shadows of that lonely house. A summer night brought with it an unexpected storm, transforming the quiet streets of Ridgeview into a gloomy, soggy landscape. The narrator, driven by a mixture of heightened curiosity and unsettling foreboding, decided it was time to confront the secrets surrounding Mrs. Dunham's house. The rain beat against his coat as he approached the worn wooden door. The dim light from the street lamp cast ghostly shadows that danced around him, as if the atmosphere itself was permeated with a tense, expectant energy. With a lump in his throat, he raised a trembling hand and knocked on the door, but the sound was drowned out by the roar of the wind and the pouring rain. After a wait that seemed like an eternity, the door creaked open slowly, revealing a dark hallway in front of it. The air was thick with a thick silence, broken only by the occasional distant rumble of thunder. Determined to move forward, he entered the house, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor with a reverberation that seemed excessively loud in the suffocating stillness. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he caught glimpses of antique furniture covered in dusty sheets and framed portraits that seemed to watch him with empty eyes. The smell of mold and neglect mixed with something more subtle, an indefinable presence that seemed to fill every nook and cranny of the house. As he explored the labyrinthine corridors, the narrator felt as if he were not alone. Shadows moved quickly around him, fleeing his peripheral vision as if playing with his tired mind. The silence was so oppressive that he could almost hear the racing beat of his own heart, echoing in the haunting solitude of that rainy night. Thus, immersed in an environment that seemed to vibrate with a supernatural energy, the narrator advanced without knowing exactly what he was looking for, but knowing that each step brought him closer to the mysteries that surrounded the life and death of Mrs. Dunham. As he progressed through the maze of shadowy hallways, the narrator finally arrived at the main room of Mrs. Dunham's house. There, he found her sitting in her favorite armchair, enveloped in a stillness that seemed to transcend the material world. Her eyes, tired and distant, stared at an indefinite point in space, as if they were looking beyond the veils of reality. "Mrs. Dunham," the narrator called, his voice sounding strangely loud in the mysterious environment. The response was a soft sigh, a minimal movement of the head that indicated a partial awareness of her presence. The elderly woman seemed to float between two worlds, trapped in a limbo where the line between life and death blurred. Determined to break the silence that hung over them, the narrator approached cautiously. He handed over the day's newspaper, waiting for a reaction that would confirm her presence and break the invisible barrier that separated them. But instead, Mrs. Dunham remained immersed in her own world, her lips moving in inaudible murmurs that echoed through the empty room. With a lump in his throat, the narrator tried again to start a conversation. "How are you today?" he asked, his words hanging in the air with a fragility that reflected his own vulnerability in that tense moment. The answer came in the form of a weak, misplaced smile, a gesture that seemed more like a shadow than a genuine expression of recognition. It was at this moment that the narrator realized the haunting truth unfolding before him. He was interacting not with the living Mrs. Dunham, but with an echo, a residual memory that refused to leave this world. The strange and incomplete communication between them revealed not only the elderly woman's loneliness in life, but also her persistence beyond death, trapped in an existence that defied all rational explanations. Thus, the narrator faced not only the invisible presence that haunted that silent house, but also the harsh reality that not all mysteries can be solved with words or gestures. The day after his strange and disturbing visit to Mrs. Dunham's house, the narrator returned with a feeling of apprehension that weighed on his shoulders like an anchor. As he approached the isolated house, he was greeted by a scene that confirmed his worst suspicions. The well-tended garden now seemed to wither under the weight of absence, while the air around him seemed permeated with a palpable sadness. Neighbors gathered in small groups, whispering in hushed tones as they stole glances toward Mrs. Dunham's house. The narrator approached a closer group, his heart clenching with the premonition of what was to come. With a lump in his throat, he asked shyly about the lonely lady who always greeted him with a tired smile. It was then that the words he so feared were spoken in a mournful whisper. Mrs. Dunham had passed away a week ago, alone in her favorite armchair. An elderly neighbor, with tears in her eyes, told how they discovered her serene body, as if she were just sleeping, but never waking up. The narrator felt a shiver run down his spine as he absorbed the brutal reality of the situation. He had been there, in the presence of something that was no longer human, a shadow from the past that refused to leave. The echo of the previous night's strange, incomplete interaction took on an entirely new meaning, a communication beyond the veil of death that left him trembling with a mixture of fear and compassion. As neighbors continued to share stories and memories of Mrs. Dunham, the narrator slowly walked away, unable to bear the weight of his own discoveries. He had touched something beyond human understanding, something that would haunt him long after that fateful day when his curiosity took him beyond the safe borders of the known world. So, amid tears and murmurs of farewell, he left Mrs. Dunham's silent house behind, taking with him an experience that would forever change his view of the world and the inexplicable mystery that permeates life and death. The narrator was paralyzed with shock as he realized the disturbing truth unfolding before him. He had interacted not with Mrs. Dunham alive, but with her spirit, trapped in a state between life and death. The certainty of this revelation cast a shadow over their certainties about the world, challenging their understanding of reality. As he walked away from the silent house, the neighbor's words echoed in his mind like an unsettling mantra. Mrs. Dunham had left a week ago, alone in her favorite armchair. The presence he encountered that rainy night was nothing more than an echo, a residual memory of the life that once inhabited those halls. The narrator felt haunted not only by his encounter with Mrs. Dunham's spirit, but also by the questions that now simmered in his mind. What really separates life from death? How do we define the boundary between the world of the living and that of spirits? That experience transcended his rational understanding, throwing him into an abyss of doubts and deep reflections. He wondered if all the neighbors' rumors and stories about unexplained events around Mrs. Dunham's house were more than mere fables. Perhaps there were more mysteries hidden beneath Ridgeview's quiet surface than he had ever imagined. The border between reality and fantasy now seemed distorted, a fine line that could be crossed by events that defied logic and scientific explanation. So, as he walked home that gray afternoon, the narrator carried with him not only the memory of Mrs. Dunham, but also a new perspective on the world and its many layers of mystery. He knew he would never be the same after that transformative experience, which confronted him with the unknown and forced him to question the truths he had always considered unshakable. The narrator slowly walked away from Mrs. Dunham's silent home, his emotions in turmoil as he processed the previous night's harrowing encounter. Each step seemed to weigh more than the last, weighed down with the weight of memories of that final interaction that defied his understanding. As he walked down the familiar streets of Ridgeview, he desperately tried to shake off the intrusive thoughts that kept flooding his mind. The image of Mrs. Dunham sitting in her armchair, her empty eyes fixed on a distant point, haunted him like a persistent ghost. He wondered if she was aware of her own condition, trapped in a liminal state between life and death. As time passed, the narrator increasingly realized the depth of the mysteries surrounding Mrs. Dunham's house and life. That experience transcended logic and conventional explanation, forcing him to recognize the existence of phenomena that escaped human understanding. He knew that no matter how hard he tried, certain secrets would remain beyond his reach, beyond the ability of the human mind to fully explain. The emotional distance he felt from the house and the figure of Mrs. Dunham was a defense against the perplexity and discomfort that the experience had left in his heart. He could no longer look at the place without feeling a chill run down his spine, remembering the shadows dancing on the curtains and the indistinct murmurs that echoed off the silent walls. However, as haunted as he was by memories of the final encounter, the narrator found a measure of peace in recognizing his own limitations in the face of the mysteries of the universe. Some secrets, he now knew, were destined to remain hidden, defying understanding and stimulating the human imagination. He carried with him not only the disturbing memories of Mrs. Dunham, but also a deep respect for the inexplicable and a renewed humility in the face of the vastness of the unknown. The impact of the experience at Mrs. Dunham's house left an indelible mark on the narrator's worldview. Even days after the disturbing encounter, he was still haunted by the shadows that danced on the walls and the indistinct whispers that echoed in his thoughts. Every time he closed his eyes, he relived the sensation of being in the presence of something beyond human understanding. Those moments in the silent house had challenged his most fundamental beliefs about life and death, leaving him with a lingering discomfort that he couldn't shake. The narrator found himself lost in thought as he walked through the familiar streets of Ridgeview. He wondered if others in the community had also felt the inexplicable presence that hovered over Mrs. Dunham's home. The neighbors avoided mentioning the subject directly, but their furtive glances and murmurs around them suggested a shared understanding, a silent complicity in the mystery that surrounded them. The experience had left a gap in his understanding of the world, an opening he struggled to close. The stories he used to regard as fables now seemed more real than ever, challenging his rationality and plunging him into a state of constant unrest. Even though he tried to return to the normality of his daily routine, the narrator knew that he would never be the same again. Mrs. Dunham's house had become a landmark in her life, a constant reminder that there are mysteries and powers beyond human understanding, shadows that move at the edges of our perception and whispers that echo in the shadows of the night. So, as time passed, he continued to carry the weight of that singular experience, an invisible scar on his soul that reminded him of the fragility of life and the immensity of the unknown that permeates the universe. As the narrator reflects on the disturbing events surrounding Mrs. Dunham, he comes to a painful but inevitable conclusion: the unknown is an intrinsic part of human existence. No matter how much we seek to understand the world around us, there are mysteries that simply escape our ability to explain. The experience at Mrs. Dunham's house was a vivid reminder that there are limits to what we can understand and what we can control. The shadows and whispers he witnessed did not fit into conventional categories of reality or fantasy. They existed in an interstitial space, where the boundaries between life and death, dream and waking, became blurred. Just as Mrs. Dunham remained an enigma even after her departure, many other mysteries in the world will continue to defy our understanding. We try to attribute meaning and logic to events that escape our understanding, but we must accept that not everything can be fully explained. This understanding brought the narrator a sense of humility in the face of the vastness of the unknown. He learned to respect the limits of his own understanding and to recognize the beauty and mystery that exists in the unexplained. As he ends this journey, the narrator carries with him not only memories of Mrs. Dunham and the silent house, but also a new perspective on the nature of the world. He knows that while mysteries can haunt and intrigue, they are also an essential part of the human experience, reminding us that there is more between heaven and earth than our vain philosophy dreams of. So he presses forward, knowing that the unknown will continue to inspire, challenge, and remind us of the depth of the human experience in this vast universe of mystery and wonder. As we conclude this journey through the mysteries of Mrs. Dunham's house, I invite you to reflect on the inexplicable that permeates our lives. What stories hide in the shadows and whispers that echo beyond our understanding? Share your own experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to leave a like if this video made you think. Share with friends who also enjoy a good mystery story, and be sure to subscribe for more content that explores the secrets that surround us. Together, we can continue exploring the mysteries that make us question and wonder.